The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be another ordinary day of duty. At 28 years old, James had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. The tradition ran deep in his blood, and he wore his bearskin hat with the same pride his ancestors had carried for generations. James came from a working-class family in Yorkshire. His father, Robert Mitchell, had served the crown for 30 years before retiring with honors. His grandfather, William Mitchell, had stood guard during World War II, even as bombs fell around London. The Mitchell family had never questioned their loyalty to the monarchy, never wavered in their dedication to duty. James grew up hearing stories of honor, sacrifice, and unwavering service to the crown. That Tuesday morning started like any other. James took his position outside the palace gates, his expression stoic and professional. Tourists gathered around, taking photographs and trying to make him smile or react. He remained motionless as trained. His mind wandered to his younger sister Sarah, who was studying medicine at university. She often teased him about being a living statue, but she understood the importance of his role. The royal guards were more than ceremonial figures. They were protectors of centuries-old traditions and the royal family itself. As the morning progressed, James noticed unusual activity around the palace. Staff members hurried back and forth with more urgency than usual. Word spread quietly among the guards that Queen Camilla would be making an unexpected appearance in the courtyard. This was unusual, as most royal engagements were scheduled well in advance. James felt a flutter of nervousness mixed with excitement. In his 6 years of service, he had seen the Queen from a distance many times, but had never been directly addressed by her. The protocol was clear and had been drilled into every guard since their first day of training. When royalty approached, guards were to remain at attention unless specifically addressed. If spoken to directly, they were to respond respectfully and follow any reasonable requests. The emphasis had always been on respect, tradition, and maintaining the dignity of the crown. James had never questioned these protocols. They were as natural to him as breathing. Around midday, a senior officer approached James's position. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "Her Majesty will be passing through this area shortly. Maintain your post and follow standard protocol." James nodded almost imperceptibly, the only acknowledgement he could give while on duty. His heart rate increased slightly, but his training kept his breathing steady and his posture perfect. The courtyard began to fill with palace staff and security personnel. James could sense the anticipation in the air. Whatever was happening, it was significant. He thought about his training, about the countless hours spent learning proper etiquette and protocol. Every guard knew the importance of their role in maintaining the image and dignity of the British monarchy. They were the visible representation of centuries of tradition. As he stood there, James reflected on what this moment meant to him personally. Serving the crown wasn't just a job, it was a calling that connected him to his family's legacy and to something greater than himself. His great-grandfather had served during the reign of King George VI. His grandfather had witnessed the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. His father had served through decades of change and modernization. Now it was James's turn to uphold the family honor. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the stone courtyard. James's training kicked in automatically. His spine straightened even more if that were possible. His eyes fixed on a point directly ahead, not moving to track the approaching figures. This was the moment every guard prepared for but rarely experienced, a direct encounter with royalty while on duty. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices and the rustle of fine clothing. James could sense movement in his peripheral vision, but he remained focused straight ahead. His breathing was controlled, his hands steady on his rifle. Everything his father and instructors had taught him came flooding back. Honor, duty, respect, tradition. These were the pillars that supported not just his stance, but his entire identity as a royal guard. What James didn't know was that this encounter would test everything he believed about duty and honor. The next few minutes would challenge 6 years of training, generations of family tradition, and his understanding of what it truly meant to serve with integrity. The young guard stood ready to face whatever came next, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. Queen Camilla emerged from the palace entrance with a small entourage of advisors and security personnel. She wore an elegant navy blue coat with matching accessories, her presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the courtyard. James maintained his rigid posture, but he could feel the weight of the royal presence as she moved closer to his position. The Queen's demeanor appeared unusually tense that morning. Recent weeks had been challenging for the royal family, with media criticism mounting over various decisions and public appearances. There had been whispers in the press about the monarchy's relevance in modern times, and some commentators had questioned the new Queen's approach to royal duties. The pressure seemed to be taking its toll, and those close to her had noticed a shift toward more assertive behavior in recent weeks. As Queen Camilla approached James's post, she paused and turned toward him with deliberate intention. Her advisors slowed their pace, sensing that something significant was about to occur. The courtyard fell into an expectant silence, with only the distant sounds of London traffic filtering through the palace walls. Security personnel positioned themselves at strategic points, their eyes scanning for any potential issues. "Guard," Queen Camilla called out in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the courtyard. James's training had prepared him for this moment. He turned his head slightly toward the Queen while maintaining his formal stance, waiting for her command. His heart pounded beneath his red tunic, but his expression remained perfectly composed. This was the moment every guard both anticipated and feared. Direct interaction with royalty while on duty. "I want you to kneel," Queen Camilla commanded, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there in her previous public appearances. The request caught James completely off guard. In 6 years of service, he had never heard of such a demand being made of a guard while on active duty. Kneeling was reserved for specific ceremonial occasions, knighthood ceremonies, or formal presentations. It was not part of standard protocol for guards at their posts. James felt a wave of confusion wash over him. His training had covered countless scenarios, but this specific situation had never been addressed. Guards were taught to obey reasonable requests from royalty, but they were also trained to maintain their posts and dignity while on duty. The request seemed to fall into a gray area that his training hadn't specifically covered. The silence in the courtyard became deafening. Palace staff members exchanged uncertain glances, clearly as surprised by the command as James was. Some of the advisors shifted uncomfortably, suggesting that this demand had not been discussed or planned in advance. The senior officer who had briefed James earlier looked equally puzzled, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious uncertainty. James's mind raced through his training, searching for guidance on how to respond. He thought about the countless hours of instruction on maintaining dignity and composure while serving the crown. His father's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that a guard's duty was to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also the honor and traditions of the monarchy itself. The young guard found himself caught between conflicting principles. On one hand, he had been trained to respect and obey royalty without question. On the other hand, his deepest training emphasized maintaining the dignity of his position and following established protocols. The request to kneel seemed to contradict everything he had been taught about proper conduct while on duty. Queen Camilla's expression hardened as she waited for James's response. The tension in her posture suggested that recent pressures had led to this moment of asserting authority in an unusual way. Perhaps she felt the need to demonstrate her position and power in the face of mounting criticism. Whatever her motivation, it was clear that she expected immediate compliance with her command. James felt the eyes of everyone in the courtyard upon him. Fellow guards at nearby posts remained at attention, but he could sense their awareness of the unprecedented situation unfolding. Palace staff members watched nervously, understanding that whatever happened next could have significant consequences for everyone involved. The weight of family tradition pressed down on James's shoulders. He thought about his grandfather's stories of unwavering loyalty during wartime, his father's decades of faithful service, and his own 6 years of dedicated duty. The Mitchell family had never been involved in any controversy or breach of protocol. Their record was spotless, their reputation beyond reproach. Yet something deep inside James rebelled against the command. It felt wrong, inappropriate, and contrary to everything he had been taught about dignity and proper conduct. The request seemed to have more to do with demonstrating power than with any legitimate royal protocol. For the first time in his career, James found himself questioning whether obedience to authority should override his sense of what was right and proper. The moment stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity, as James wrestled with the most difficult decision of his career. James took a deep breath and made a decision that would echo through the halls of Buckingham Palace for years to come. Looking directly at Queen Camilla with respectful but firm eyes, he spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried across the silent courtyard. "Your Majesty," James said, his Yorkshire accent barely detectable through his trained pronunciation, "with the greatest respect, I cannot comply with that request. My duty as a royal guard requires me to maintain my post and dignity while serving the crown." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Never in the modern history of the Royal Guard had anyone witnessed such a direct refusal of a royal command. Palace staff members gasped audibly, their faces reflecting shock and disbelief. Security personnel tensed, unsure whether this constituted a security threat or simply unprecedented insubordination. Queen Camilla's face flushed with a mixture of surprise and anger. She had not expected resistance to her authority, especially not from a young guard who should have been eager to please. Her advisors stepped closer, whispering urgently about how to handle this extraordinary breach of protocol. The situation was spiraling into uncharted territory. "Excuse me?" Queen Camilla's voice rose several octaves, her composure cracking under the pressure of public defiance. "Did you just refuse a direct command from your queen?" James maintained his respectful posture, but his resolve only strengthened. "Your Majesty, I have sworn an oath to serve the crown with honor and dignity. Kneeling while on duty would compromise the traditions and protocols that have guided the Royal Guard for centuries. I believe my duty is to uphold these standards, even when faced with difficult decisions." The senior officer who had briefed James earlier stepped forward, his face pale with concern. He had served for over 20 years and had never encountered anything like this situation. Protocol demanded that he support royal authority. But something about James's stance resonated with his own understanding of guard duty and tradition. Other guards at nearby posts remained perfectly still, but their awareness of the unfolding drama was unmistakable. Some had served longer than James and recognized the complexity of the situation. The young guard wasn't being disrespectful or insolent. He was actually demonstrating the highest form of respect for the institution they all served. James thought about his sister Sarah, who would probably be proud of him for standing up for his principles. She had always admired his dedication to duty, but she had also taught him to think for himself and stand up for what was right. His family had raised him to respect authority, but also to maintain his integrity even when it was difficult. Queen Camilla's anger was now clearly visible to everyone present. She had expected this to be a simple demonstration of her authority, perhaps motivated by recent criticisms and the need to assert her position. Instead, she found herself in a public confrontation with a guard who was refusing to back down. The situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone involved. "This is unacceptable," Queen Camilla declared, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "I will not tolerate this kind of insubordination from someone whose salary I pay." Her words revealed the personal nature of her feelings about the refusal, suggesting that this was about more than just protocol or tradition. James felt a surge of emotion at the Queen's words, but he kept his voice calm and respectful. "Your Majesty, I understand your displeasure, but I serve the crown and the traditions it represents, not personal preferences. My oath was to protect and honor the monarchy as an institution, which includes maintaining the dignity and protocols that have served it well for generations." The confrontation was attracting attention from other areas of the palace. Staff members who had been going about their normal duties began to gather at windows and doorways, trying to understand what was happening in the courtyard. Word was spreading quickly through the palace corridors that something extraordinary was taking place. Palace security was in a difficult position. They couldn't treat James as a threat because he wasn't being aggressive or dangerous. Yet they also couldn't ignore the fact that he was directly refusing a royal command. Their training hadn't prepared them for this type of situation, where the conflict was about principle rather than security. James's fellow guards began to understand the gravity of what was happening. Some felt conflicted, torn between loyalty to their colleague and their duty to royal authority. Others quietly admired James's courage in standing up for what he believed was right, even knowing it would likely cost him his career. The young guard remained perfectly still in his formal stance despite the chaos swirling around him. His decision was made, and he would accept whatever consequences followed. He had chosen to honor his understanding of duty over blind obedience, believing that true service to the crown meant protecting its dignity and traditions, even from the crown itself when necessary. Within minutes of the confrontation, senior palace officials began arriving in the courtyard. The private secretary to the Queen, a distinguished gentleman named Sir Robert Thornfield, hurried from the main palace building with several other high-ranking staff members. Their faces reflected the seriousness of the situation and the potential implications for the royal household. Sir Robert had served the royal family for over 15 years and had navigated countless diplomatic crises, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. A royal guard publicly refusing a direct command from the Queen was unprecedented in modern times. The situation required immediate damage control, but it also demanded careful consideration of the principles at stake. Queen Camilla turned to Sir Robert with visible frustration. "I want this guard removed immediately," she demanded. "His behavior is completely unacceptable, and I will not tolerate such disrespect." Her anger was genuine, but those who knew her well could also detect underlying uncertainty about how to proceed. Sir Robert approached James with a mixture of authority and curiosity. He had heard the guard's explanation and found himself unexpectedly impressed by the young man's articulate defense of his position. "Guardsman Mitchell," he said formally, "you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, sir," James replied without hesitation. "I understand that my career is likely over, but I believe I have acted in accordance with my oath and the highest traditions of the Royal Guard. I have tried to serve the crown with honor, even when that service required a difficult decision." The private secretary studied James carefully. In his years of service, he had encountered many palace staff members who were eager to please at any cost, but he had rarely met someone willing to sacrifice their career for principle. There was something compelling about the young guard's unwavering commitment to what he believed was right. Meanwhile, word of the incident was beginning to spread beyond the palace walls. In the age of social media and instant communication, news traveled quickly, and several palace staff members had already begun discussing the events with friends and family outside the royal household. The story was gaining momentum, even though official channels had not yet acknowledged what had happened. James's father, Robert Mitchell, received a phone call from a friend who worked in palace security. The news hit him like a physical blow. His son had refused a direct command from the Queen, something that went against everything the Mitchell family had stood for across 3 generations of service. Yet as the details emerged, Robert found himself feeling a complex mixture of concern and pride. Queen Camilla's advisors were quickly realizing that this situation could become a public relations nightmare, if not handled carefully. A story about a royal guard standing up for tradition and dignity could easily be spun in ways that would reflect poorly on the Queen's leadership and judgment. They began discussing strategies for minimizing the potential damage. Sir Robert made a decision that surprised everyone present. Instead of immediately ordering James's removal, he requested a private meeting with the guard to better understand his perspective. This was highly unusual, but the private secretary recognized that the situation required careful handling rather than hasty action. "Guardsman Mitchell," Sir Robert said, "I'm going to ask you to step aside for a moment so we can discuss this matter properly. This is not a dismissal, but rather an opportunity for us to understand your position more fully." The offer was unexpected and showed a level of respect that James had not anticipated. As James stepped away from his post for the first time in 6 years for reasons other than scheduled breaks, he felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. He had made his stand, but now he had to face the consequences of his decision. The weight of family tradition and personal conviction continued to pull at him from different directions. Other guards watched as James was escorted toward a private office within the palace. Some felt sympathy for their colleague's situation, while others worried about the precedent his actions might set. The Royal Guard had always prided itself on unity and adherence to protocol, but James's stand had introduced questions that many had never considered. Queen Camilla remained in the courtyard, her anger slowly giving way to uncertainty. Her advisors continued to discuss the situation in hushed tones, trying to determine the best course of action. The incident had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and the potential ramifications were becoming clearer with each passing minute. The palace corridors buzzed with conversation as staff members tried to process what they had witnessed. Many had never seen anything like James's quiet defiance, and opinions were divided about whether he had acted courageously or foolishly. What everyone agreed on was that this moment would be remembered for years to come. As James walked through the palace halls toward an uncertain future, he thought about the oath he had taken 6 years earlier. He had promised to serve the crown with honor and dignity, and he believed he had done exactly that, even though it had led to this unprecedented confrontation. In the private office overlooking the palace gardens, Sir Robert Thornfield sat across from James Mitchell, studying the young guard with growing respect. The room was elegantly furnished with antique furniture and portraits of former monarchs, creating an atmosphere that emphasized the weight of royal tradition and history. "Guardsman Mitchell," Sir Robert began, "in my 15 years of service to the royal household, I have never encountered a situation quite like this. Your refusal to comply with a direct royal command is, by any measure, extraordinary. However, I find myself interested in understanding your reasoning more fully." James sat straight in his chair, maintaining his military bearing even in these unusual circumstances. "Sir Robert, I understand that my actions appear to be insubordination, but I believe they represent the highest form of service to the crown. The Royal Guard exists to protect not just the physical safety of the royal family, but also the dignity and traditions that make the monarchy meaningful." The private secretary leaned back in his chair, processing James's words carefully. He had spent years navigating the complex relationships between tradition, protocol, and the personal wishes of royal family members. The young guard's perspective offered a fresh viewpoint on questions that had been debated in palace corridors for decades. "Tell me about your family's history with the Royal Guard," Sir Robert requested, genuinely curious about the background that had shaped James's convictions. The question opened a door for James to share the stories that had formed his understanding of duty and service. James spoke about his grandfather William, who had stood guard during the Blitz, never abandoning his post even when bombs fell around London. He talked about his father Robert's 30 years of faithful service, and the pride the Mitchell family had always taken in their unblemished record of loyalty and dedication. "Sir Robert, my family has served the crown for 3 generations without a single mark against our record. Today's events don't change that legacy, they continue it." Meanwhile, news of the confrontation was spreading throughout London and beyond. Social media platforms began buzzing with discussions about the guard who had refused to kneel, though details remained scarce since no official statement had been released. Public opinion was beginning to form, with many people expressing admiration for what they perceived as principled resistance to arbitrary authority. James's sister, Sarah, received a text message from a friend asking if the guard in the news was her brother. The story was gaining traction faster than anyone at the palace had anticipated. Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with worry, knowing that her brother had acted according to his principles but uncertain about what consequences he might face. Queen Camilla, still processing the morning's events, met with her own advisors to discuss how to respond to the situation. Some counseled immediate dismissal of the guard to demonstrate royal authority, while others suggested a more measured approach that would avoid creating a public martyr. The decision was complicated by the growing public awareness of the incident. Sir Robert continued his conversation with James, asking probing questions about protocol, tradition, and the guard's understanding of his duties. What emerged was a picture of a young man who had thought deeply about his role and responsibilities, not someone acting on impulse or disrespect. "Guardsman Mitchell, your knowledge of royal protocol and tradition is impressive. Have you considered that your interpretation might differ from others?" "Yes, sir," James replied thoughtfully. "I understand that others might view my actions differently. However, I believe that true loyalty sometimes requires the courage to respectfully disagree, even with those we serve. The monarchy has survived for centuries because it has been served by people who cared more about its long-term dignity than short-term convenience." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A junior staff member entered with news that the story was beginning to appear in online news outlets, though without official confirmation from the palace. The situation was moving beyond internal palace management into the realm of public relations and media strategy. Sir Robert realized that time was running short for making decisions about how to handle James's case. The longer the palace waited to respond, the more the narrative would be shaped by speculation and incomplete information. Yet rushing to judgment could create an even larger problem if the public perceived the response as heavy-handed or unfair. "Guardsman Mitchell," Sir Robert said finally, "I want you to remain available while we consider how to proceed. This is not a suspension, but rather a temporary assignment to allow for proper deliberation. Your service record and the unusual nature of today's events require careful consideration." James felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. He had not been immediately dismissed, which suggested that his perspective was being taken seriously. However, he understood that his future remained uncertain, and the growing public attention was adding pressure to an already complex situation. As news outlets began reaching out to palace press offices for comment, the royal household found itself facing a crisis that no media training had prepared them for. The story of a royal guard standing up for tradition and dignity was inherently compelling, and it was becoming clear that this incident would not quietly disappear. 3 days after the confrontation, the palace corridors hummed with unprecedented activity. The story of James Mitchell's refusal to kneel had captured public imagination in ways that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. Opinion polls showed overwhelming support for the young guard's stance, with many people viewing his actions as a defense of dignity and tradition rather than disrespect toward the monarchy. Sir Robert Thornfield had spent countless hours in meetings with senior advisors, legal experts, and public relations specialists. The consensus was emerging that James's actions, while technically insubordinate, had actually demonstrated the kind of principled service that the royal household should celebrate rather than punish. The guard had shown more understanding of royal dignity than many career courtiers. James had spent these 3 days in strange limbo, temporarily relieved of guard duty but not formally suspended or dismissed. He remained at his modest flat in London, fielding calls from reporters and declining all interview requests while waiting for official word about his future. His father had driven down from Yorkshire, and the two men had spent long hours discussing duty, tradition, and the sometimes conflicting demands of service. The breakthrough came when Sir Robert received an unexpected visitor. Prince William, heir to the throne, had requested a private meeting to discuss the situation. The prince had been following the story closely and had his own thoughts about what James's actions represented for the future of the monarchy. "Sir Robert," Prince William said as they met in the private secretary's office, "I've been thinking about this guard situation. His refusal wasn't an act of disrespect. It was an act of service to something bigger than any individual, including members of my own family. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in people who serve the crown." This perspective provided the framework for a solution that no one had initially considered. Rather than punishing James for his refusal to kneel, the palace would recognize his actions as exemplifying the highest ideals of royal service. It was an unprecedented approach, but then again, the entire situation had been unprecedented from the beginning. Queen Camilla, after days of reflection and consultation with her advisors, had come to understand that her initial command had been inappropriate. The pressure she had been feeling from media criticism had led to a moment of poor judgment that could have been damaging to the monarchy, if not for James's principled response. She agreed to the proposal that Sir Robert presented to her. On a crisp Friday morning, James Mitchell was summoned back to Buckingham Palace, but not to face discipline. Instead, he found himself in the same courtyard where the confrontation had occurred, this time facing Sir Robert and a small group of senior officials in what appeared to be a formal ceremony. "Guardsman Mitchell," Sir Robert announced in a clear voice that carried across the courtyard, "your recent actions have demonstrated an understanding of duty and service that exemplifies the highest traditions of the Royal Guard. Rather than compromising the dignity of the crown, you protected it through your principled stance and respectful defiance of an inappropriate command." James stood at attention, hardly believing what he was hearing. Instead of facing dismissal or punishment, he was being commended for the very actions that had seemed certain to end his career. The palace had chosen to turn a potential crisis into an affirmation of the values that the monarchy claimed to represent. "Therefore," Sir Robert continued, You are hereby promoted to the rank of sergeant and assigned to a new position as an instructor for incoming guards, where you will help train the next generation in the proper understanding of duty, tradition, and principled service to the crown. The promotion was accompanied by a private letter from Prince William, acknowledging James's courage and expressing gratitude for his dedication to royal dignity. The letter would remain private, but its contents gave James a sense of validation that meant more than any public recognition could have provided. James's family received the news with joy and relief. His father Robert felt vindicated in his belief that true service sometimes required difficult choices. His sister Sarah was proud that her brother had stood up for his principles and been recognized for doing so. The Mitchell family's legacy of honorable service had not only been preserved, but enhanced. The story became a defining moment for the modern monarchy, demonstrating that the institution could adapt and learn from challenges rather than simply suppressing them. James's refusal to kneel became a symbol of the kind of thoughtful, principled service that the crown needed in the 21st century. Years later, as Sergeant James Mitchell trained new guards, he would tell them about the importance of understanding the difference between blind obedience and true service. His students learned that protecting the crown sometimes meant protecting it from itself, and that real loyalty required the courage to do what was right even when it was difficult. The young man from Yorkshire, who had refused to kneel, had not only saved his career, but had helped save the dignity of the institution he served. His moment of pure defiance had become a moment of pure service, demonstrating that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the willingness to respectfully say no.